Well, welcome everybody. Hope you're enjoying the conference so far. Welcome to our soils panel. Today we're going to be talking about soil impacts, reproductive health, and some of the work that's being done by our panelists to address those issues. Today we have with us Ingrid Brostrom with the Center for Race, Poverty, and the Environment. She's the Assistant Director. And Jazmine Johnson with Physicians for Social Responsibility of Los Angeles. And Janet Venezuela. Venezuela. I've been practicing this, Janet. Am I doing it right?
You're doing it right.
Okay. I'm like, they put a Z in there. And she's with East Yards for Community and Environmental Justice, and she's a community organizer. So I think we have amazing people that are doing amazing work. They're going to talk to you a little bit about it. We're going to pose a couple questions to the panel and then open it up to the rest of you for questions and answers. I'm Cynthia Babich. I'm director of the Amo Action Committee. Here's part of my crew, my favorite part of my crew, up there near Booger Bear at the Capitol, which I tell everybody don't touch. Because one of the security guards told me one time about how many people touch that, and I'm like, oh yeah, I don't see any wet wipes. So this is our crew. Most of them started when they were 8 years old. Our oldest now is 21, with her boyfriend here at the end. That's where people come to meet and spend the rest of their lives together, I guess, in our organization. So we got involved in our community basically because people were having unexplained illnesses, bloody noses, rashes, nausea, vomiting, miscarriages, things of that nature. And we soon discovered that we were on a Superfund site. These are the federal most toxic sites in the country. This particular community has two of them. One is the Del Amo site, a synthetic rubber plant, and the other is the largest DDT manufacturer in the world. And they happen to take some of that DDT and dump it into portions of the yard. Also, they had it being ground outside, so it blew through the yard. People tell stories back in the day of coming through our community. It looked like somebody sprinkled powdered sugar all over the whole place. And so I got involved and formed our organization when I started getting really sick, and I was in the hospital and I almost died, and the doctors couldn't really figure out what was wrong, and it turned out to be my female organs, my ovaries, and that made me start thinking really what's going on. I feel like I'm an average person in the sense that I don't have allergies or things of that nature, and why would I have something unexplained that other people don't have? During the time I was trying to heal and recover, I literally tore up my whole backyard to put in an organic garden, not knowing that I had 97% pure DDT buried in my backyard, 976,000 parts per million. And that's because the nearby factory often dumped it wherever they could, because it was just so cheap to make, 19 cents a bag. If they made a bad batch, they either dumped it into the sewer system and it went out to the Palos Verdes shelf and is poisoning the eagles and the whales, I would imagine, out there. And then it ran through our community. So we have a ground zero community situation. And while I was healing from one of my surgeries, I moved to another location in the community, more on top of the DDT, not knowing it. And my nose started bleeding. And then my husband's nose was bleeding. And so I thought, this is just not normal. And so we put a little flyer together and put it out in the community asking, are other people's noses bleeding? And after they kind of wondered, like, who is this person, must be looking in our bathroom windows, we started putting it together. And I think what we came to find was that there was a lot of contamination in our community, and it was soil contamination. And we started demanding that the EPA come in and do more testing, and that's when they found the pure DDT in my backyard after they told me at least 10 times, Mrs. Babich, we're very confident there's nothing in your yard. So pretty much when somebody says that to you 10 times and then they find the mother load of DDT in your backyard, you are not listening anymore to that. So some of the things that we started to do was doing our own investigation and looking into things, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but just to say that, our work has now been 25 years in the community. We've had a lot of people come and help us or try to help us from agencies, ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substance Disease Registry. We've had many studies done, studies and studies and studies and studies, and we are not having any more studies because we already know what the problem is, and now it's time for people to act on that problem. And so we want you to enjoy what you hear from your panelists today and giving you some ideas of maybe some things you can do in your own community. So having said that, I will turn it over to Ingrid. Thank you very much.
Great, well, thank you. Good morning still. I'm with the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, and we are an environmental justice organization based in the Central Valley. So I do most of my work in Kern County. But I also do a lot of statewide work. And before I really get started, I'd like to get a sense of who's in the room. If you are from an agency, can you raise your hand? Do you have any agency folks here? Medical, people in the medical field, so about half. And then advocates, community advocates, a couple. And what other category? Academics. Am I missing any big categories? Government. All right, seems like we have a good mix. That's great. So I'm going to start by zooming out a little bit and looking at some of, how California handles its cleanups and hazardous waste. So I'm going to start with a question. Does anyone know what the largest source of hazardous waste is in California? Any guesses?
It's contaminated soil.
Yes. Contaminated soil is California's largest source of hazardous waste, and it makes up 25% of all the hazardous waste in California going to our hazardous waste facilities is soil. So let's give a little backdrop on California's cleanups. Right now, there are 90,000 cleanup sites in California. So 90,000. So you look at, you go to DTSC's website, there's something called EnviroStore. And if you click on your address, inevitably, there will be a dozen little circles showing where there's contaminated sites in California. So there's a lot. And of these 90,000, at any given time, about 220 of those are undergoing some sort of cleanup. So that means there's a lot of sites just sitting that are not getting cleaned up. And on average, California completes only 125. Can people hear me?
No.
Is this better? Can you hear me now? Okay. So at any given, in any year, only 125 cleanup sites are completed. So that means that California just has a lot of contamination. So how do these things get cleaned up? Well, California has a polluter pays principle. So that means, in essence, that's a in theory that people that contaminate the land, the industrial uses, the polluters that are putting things in our soils, they have to clean up, and they're responsible for paying for that cleanup. But it also creates this incentive to do it fast and to do it cheap or to not do it at all. So we have an oversight agency called the Department of Toxic Substances Control, and they're in charge of all the cleanups for California. And so if you're relying on the polluter to figure out what they're going to do to clean it up, they're going to go for the cheapest option. And if you have an agency that is under-resourced and understaffed, they really throw up their hands. So you have this situation now where most of our hazardous waste or contaminated sites are dealt with in one of two ways. One is just to put a cap on it. Literally, you just concrete it over, and you hope that it holds. Hope that cement holds the contamination in place and keeps it from coming up. We know that with 100% of the time, the caps will fail. It's just a matter of how long will it take, how long before there's a crack or a hole or there's rain that gets in and either pushes the contamination further down into the groundwater or allows it to vaporize and come up. So 100% certainty those caps will fail. The other cheapest option to deal with contaminated soil is to dig and haul. So that literally means let's pick it all up and take it to a hazardous waste facility. there are 81 operating hazardous waste facilities in California right now. 3 hazardous waste landfills, 2 which are operational, and they receive most of the state's hazardous contaminated soils. And at the same time that many of the contaminated sites are in low-income communities of color, so too are the hazardous waste facilities. So we have this system in California of shifting the burden from contaminated sites that are in very vulnerable and overburdened areas to hazardous waste facilities, which are in very vulnerable and overburdened areas. So the other problem, systemic problem, is that oftentimes when you start restricting or putting more restrictions on hazardous waste facilities, or we run out of room, which happened recently with one of the landfills in Kettleman City that was at capacity, then suddenly not only were we redistributing the harms and the burdens amongst California communities, we started shipping it out of state. And once you ship it out of state, once you cross into Arizona or Nevada, what's hazardous waste in California is no longer hazardous waste. It's this fiction that you cross the state boundaries, and because their laws are less strict and they're more lenient, suddenly you have hazardous waste going to municipal landfills with no protections, no restrictions, and no protective barriers to keep that hazardous waste from contaminating communities in Arizona and Nevada. So I don't have the answers, but what I do know is, as a state, we need to have some reform. We need to figure out how we're not always going to the very cheapest options. Right now, it's mandated by federal law that only the most cost-effective cleanups can be approved. So anything that requires innovation or technology or some way of destroying the contamination in place cannot, by law, be approved. That's what they tell me anyway. I actually don't think that that's true, but that's what the state says. And then when you start looking at, well, what about community choice? What about community decision-making? Well, in a cleanup, the agencies or the polluters, they have to go talk to the community eventually. But it's the last place they go. It's out of 9 criteria, it's number 9, so it's last criteria. And they only go to the community to ask for their input after the decision has really been made. So I don't know of a single instance where an agency or a polluter has gone to a community and the community says, no, we don't want that. And they actually listen, okay, let's start over from scratch and let's try to figure out another way forward. So it really is a checkbox where the engagement with the communities is not genuine, it's not meaningful, and it doesn't lead to meaningful change. So that's one problem, that's one systematic problem. The other problem is funding. So when there's a responsible party, they pay as little as they can, but they pay for cleanup and monitoring and they do what they have to do. But for a large number of sites in California, there is no responsible party. Maybe it was a little mom and pop operation. Dry cleaners are a big source. They don't have the funds to clean up a site that they may have contributed to, or they go bankrupt, or they walk away, or they're no longer in operation. And for all of these communities, there is no one to pay for the cleanup. And so what happens? So they go on California's orphan site list. And this state is actually out of money. That fund is gone. They're trying to make do right now. I think it's actually going to be completely depleted in 1 or 2 years. So there'll be no money left in that fund. And all of these orphan sites will just have to wait until the state can figure out how to fund the cleanups. This fund is depleted because as more and more federal sites get cleaned up, or they get their technology or whatever they're doing to clean up, the state has to pay for the operation, the ongoing operation and maintenance. They have to replace the caps when they crack, things like that. And so now, almost all of that fund is going to maintaining the federal cleanup sites. So all of the state cleanups, there's nobody responsible, they're sitting. So right now, California's cleaning up about half of the entire list, and the other half are just waiting until they can get back. So people live near these sites. They may or may not know that these sites are even there. There may or may not be temporary protective measures. But it's a disaster waiting to happen. It's a disaster that is happening for these communities where there's no cleanup happening. And just very quickly, I think my time is almost over, but I wanted to just give 2 examples that I've worked on that kind of demonstrate some of the problems with the state's management of cleanups and its management of hazardous waste facilities. So I talked about Kettleman City, and that's the site of the largest hazardous waste landfill in the western United States. It's the only landfill that accepts PCBs in California, and one of only 8 facilities in the entire US that accepts PCBs. PCBs are linked with lots of horrible things, but they're linked with cleft palate and birth defects. So in 2008, Kettleman City residents discovered that 11 babies had been born with birth defects in an 18-month period. This is a town of about 500 people. And half of those babies were born with some sort of cleft. And in another kind of systemic problem, the Department of Public Health came in to do some testing, and they, I don't know if people are familiar with the birth defect monitoring program, but they came in. And just like every other time that they had investigated a potential birth defect cluster, they were unable to find any environmental link. So here's a program that we have in the state of California that has not once found a link between the environment and a birth defect cluster. And I know it's difficult. I know it's difficult to make those findings. But what happened there was, because there wasn't a link found by the state, they ended up expanding the hazardous waste facility. And basically now are keeping it open for another 30 years. So it's a failure. It's a big failure of the state. And just very quickly, the second instance is in Delano, which is in Kern County. There was a PCB plume. It's one of these orphan sites. It's one of the ones that is getting cleaned up, but because of a lack of communication and community engagement, just very recently, in the last last month or so, we found out that the health clinic has come to town, which is great. We need more health clinics. But they built right on top of this plume of PCE and TCE. This is the dry cleaner site. And the city knew about it and didn't say anything and gave the permits. DTSC knew about it, knew about the plume, but didn't know that there was something being built there. So now we have a beautiful new health clinic, and they did the testing, and indeed there's TCE, PCE vaporizing into the building where people go to get healthy. So it's a fundamental breakdown, when people aren't talking to each other, and when we have these sites that just sit there and we don't know where they are. So I think I'm out of time, and would love to answer questions later, but there are some real big systemic problems in how our state deals with hazardous waste.
Thank you, Ingrid.
So we're going to go next to Jazmine, please.
And she's with Physicians for Social Responsibility in Los Angeles. She's the land use associate with their health program. And Physicians for Social Responsibility as well does amazing work. So thank you, Jazmine.
Thank you. I also have a.
Oh, let me push your button. Oh. Ooh. It's saying you're upside down. That's a nice way to say that to someone.
Okay,
Huh.
perfect. So, like I said, I'm with Physicians for Social Responsibility, and I work in the on our land use on health program. And And so we focus on the built environment and health, but specifically industrial land use and how that impacts health. So Dr. Bubla, who is absolutely amazing, who's been working with us for a while, gave half of my presentation this morning when she talked about Jordan Downs. So I know a lot of you guys already have seen this map, but just to kind of go over some of the highlights again. This is a small community down in the Watts area that is predominantly people of color, Black and brown folks, and low-income folks, and it's predominantly single family, single mothers and children in this neighborhood. And what I don't think Dr. Kugula mentioned this morning is that several years ago there were plans to revitalize the community, which entailed tearing down 700 units of subsidized housing and replacing it with a mixed-use development, which would include 1,400, I think, to 1,800 mixed-income units. And they wanted to start the project here in the middle, which Dr. Kugula so this site right here, which Dr. Kugula mentioned, was formerly used as a steel manufacturing facility, and at some point they did, I think, trucking operations and possibly metal recycling. So this is a huge brownfield in the middle of this community filled with children and mothers and families. And there were concerns about the quality of the soil and the environment in general that weren't being addressed, but now that they were proposing to build new homes here, the community, with the help of the coalition that PSRLA was also a part of, the Jordan Downs Environmental Justice Coalition, pushed to have them test this land to figure out, is this actually safe? Which everyone knew it wasn't, but it was the idea of making sure that the housing authority and the city and the developers recognized that. So they did test this land, and they found that there were elevated levels of lead, of arsenic, of petroleum hydrocarbons, of polychlorinated bisphenols, BCPs, lots of terrible things that lead to reproductive harm and harming children and increased risk of cardiovascular disease, of asthma. Also, you have this high school down here that's right next to this this metal recycling, or this metal plating facility, Atlas Metals, that was also contaminating the land around the school. So again, around here you're finding elevated levels of lead, and arsenic, and zinc, and copper. You also have several gas facilities in the area that is, like many of these facilities, like Ingrid mentioned, have leaks and have breaches. And they actually found a TCE plume just north of one of these sites. I want to say it was the Exxon site, but I can't remember exactly. But like she said, you have you run the risk of, if this happens, you have this vapor intrusion where the vapors seep out of the ground, out of the soil, and into the homes through the floor, and into other buildings where you find concentrations of sensitive receptors, of sensitive communities. So like Dr. Pugla mentioned this morning, unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident. And so we work largely in the communities of South and Southeast LA. So Jordan Downs is, I'm going to say down here. This is going to be downtown. So we're over here. The map is flipped. Sorry, so I'm a little disoriented. So the map is flipped. So yeah, so we're over here. But this is South and Southeast LA, which is, again, a community that's historically people of color, Black and brown folk, and low income as well. And again, you have lots of families and lots of children. And if you look at the map, you'll see lots of blue and yellow marks. And what the blue represents are hazardous facilities. And what the yellow represents are going to be sensitive receptors, where you find high concentrations of sensitive populations. So schools and hospitals and clinics. And as you can see, unfortunately, just like the Jordan Downs community, just like Flint, just like Wilmington and Boyle Heights, you see in South and Southeast LA, you see a large clusters of industrial sites near sensitive receptors. So what PSRLA did is we kind of compiled a lot of the data from the city, from regulatory agencies, to see what is actually in these neighborhoods, what could potentially be impacting these residents that they're not even aware of. And just like a lot of the facilities we saw in Jordan Downs, we see them here. They have high concentrations of gas stations and of electroplating facilities, of metal facilities, recycling facilities. We also have lots of dry cleaners, which Ingrid mentioned, produces PCE, and that's again also causes reproductive harm. You have lots of warehouses and transportation hubs. And so what we found through our initial analysis is that there are over 1,300 hazardous uses in close proximity to the 585 sensitive uses that we identified. So this is not just in the community, but in close proximity. And we use what we call a 500-foot buffer analysis to do this. So based on CARB's recommendation that you should not cite a hazardous facility within close proximity to sensitive receptors such as homes and schools. And most uses, they suggested at least a 500-foot buffer. So these are uses that are within 500 feet of each other. And like I said, you see that there are a number of them in these communities. So what we did is we created a hazard mapping tool in order to help visualize and understand and help allow the community to actually identify what's in close proximity to their homes, to their schools, to their jobs, their daycare centers, their hospitals, to be able to see, and not just for the residents, but for community advocates, for policymakers, for planners, because the question is not just what's there, but how close is it? How much harm is it creating? And so through this tool, you're actually able to select specific parcels of land and not only see how close it is, but you can see exactly what it is. So if you click on these, it'll drop down and it'll show you what those buildings are being used for. Because a lot of times, I've been in these communities. I actually live in South LA. You don't even know what's there. You just see a big white building with a number on it, and there's no identification on the building. There's no notices saying like, this is harmful. I don't know if you guys have been down there and seen big brick walls, and behind them they're actually, oil refineries. So a lot of these aren't even identifiable as being a hazardous facility. So what this map allows you to do is not only know that there is a hazardous facility nearby, but to see what is that hazardous facility, and who is keeping track of it, because it also shows you the source of like where this information is coming from, who's supposed to be regulating them. And so, but we also wanted to make sure not just to notify the community or say, hey, this is what's in the neighborhood, but we made sure to get involved and engage with community residents to be able to say, what's here, but what do you see and what do you hear? Because we as outsiders per se, we're not the experts in the community. And while we can pull together data, we don't know exactly what's there. And unfortunately, what we learned through our data collection, through our research, is that the regulatory agencies don't know either. A lot of it's inaccurate and it's incomplete. A lot of businesses have moved or have shut down. A lot of businesses have been built or expanded and never registered, or just not on their radar. So unfortunately, as much information as this map provides, it's very incomplete, because we only could pull what we could find in LA City business data, or what EPA is regulating, which they have these crazy high thresholds as far as what they deem, like significant enough to regulate, without taking into consideration the impacts of cumulative burden. So as you saw on the previous map, you have lots of clusters like this, and a lot of them are too small to even be regulated by agencies such as EPA. So what we did is we conducted these ground truthing workshops where we engaged with residents and talked to them about land use planning and what good and bad land use planning looks like. What are the health implications of living near a lot of these sites? What happens? How do you come in contact with a lot of these harmful chemicals? So through skin contact or through inhalation, and it causes headaches, or it can cause birth defects. It can cause, these chemicals are shown to increase your risk of preterm birth or miscarriages, so that they're aware of, that these things that are happening are not just happening just because, that they can be and likely are related to the environment that they live in. And then along with that, like I said, because the data was incomplete, we needed to help create a clear picture of what exactly was in the environment. So we went ahead and we went out and actually ground truthed the area. So we walked out around with community members, as you can see here, and we figured out what was there. What is gone, what's still here, and what isn't listed by the regulatory agencies. And actually, what we found I think within the first 3 or 4 census tracts, we added about, I want to say 150 additional uses that were not in the list. This was out of, I think, a total of about 250 uses that were supposed to be round tripping. We added an additional 150. So imagine not even knowing what's in your community. So not only was it important to let them know what was there, but to learn from them about what actually is there so that we could possibly use this data to tell these regulatory agencies like, hey, not only do we have this problem based on what you said is here, but we also have a problem based on what you don't even know is here. So like Dr. Pula mentioned, the popular education portion was very important because not only were we able to teach the community, but we were able to learn a lot from them as well and hopefully create solutions around this. So my time's up, so I'll go ahead and
Thank you, Jazmine. That's really an important piece. I think getting out in the neighborhood, nothing really beats that as far as a tool in your toolbox. So thank you. Janet?
So you think that these 2 panelists covered so much, what could I possibly talk about, right? So my name is Janet Valenzuela. I'm with ECR Communities for Environmental Justice. I want to bring a little bit about like community experiential knowledge to this panel. So talk a little bit about how I came to EJ, but also working with ECR, some of the resilient work that we do in the organization. I kind of want to guide you all through like a little exercise, if you all don't mind, to shake things up a bit. So I want you all to do me this favor and like close your eyes, or you can put your head down, and I want you all to really think about what is your perfect environment, right? Like what are you seeing? What do you smell? What are you walking on? A perfect environment. All right, so I could see your reactions. So I see a lot of smiles, like a lot of positivity right now. Does anybody want to share what they saw in their perfect environment? You can just shout it out.
Trees.
Trees,
Like
yep, I
forest
see a lot of head nods, yeah. Anything else?
On the hills, very spacious.
Really good things, really good things.
Water.
Water, clean water, fresh water. Okay, so you don't have to close your eyes this time, but I want you to think about, reflect on where you grew up, your work environment, or when you go to the grocery store. What do you see in that environment?
Concrete.
Concrete. I'm gonna just say it for everyone, traffic. There's just a lot going on.
Yes.
And so when I was in high school, there was a group of community organizers that came in and made me do this exact same exercise. For many of my classmates, our surrounding environment looked like a lot of vandalism, a lot of trash. I grew up in Huntington Park, that's also in Southeast LA. I'm a couple blocks away from the city of Vernon. And so living near the city of Vernon, we have one of the largest pig slaughter houses. And so growing up next to that, I remember having to not play outside sometimes in elementary school because it would smell like, I remember like when we did that exercise and they asked what's in your environment, a lot of my classmates said, it smells like pig's ass. And I would say that's the best way to describe it, right? That there are certain days that I couldn't go play outside. And then, so when they posed me that question and they started engaging with us, like it was through that reflection that I was just like, I want to learn more. And that for me was an aha moment, right? That I saw something was wrong that I never thought was wrong because I had normalized it for so long. And that's a lot of the realities for people in my community, is that we've come to normalize a lot of trucks close to schools. We normalized a lot of freeway entrances. We have normalized a lot of industry, right? And so getting involved from a really young age and working now with East Yard, East Yard was very successful in shutting down Excite Technologies. So how many of you have heard of Excite? Right? Excite Technologies emitted 100,000 tons of lead in near 10,000 residential homes. And so my home was one of them. And so thinking about like how I had to explain that to my mom, right? How I had to explain to her and read to her the letter that DTSC sent. And just telling her like what this letter says is that the government failed you. DTSC failed us, right? They failed Kettleman City. They failed the people that live near Jordan High School. And so it's through this work that really East Yards puts forward the narrative and the power of frontline communities, right? And so the way I would like to describe how we took on Excite is that we didn't win Excite in DC. We didn't win Excite in Sacramento. Like we won Excite on our hoods, right? On the ground, going to community membership meetings, going to public meetings. And so that to me was very powerful, and I think out of experience right now with the work that I'm doing with East Yard, I was brought on to do the La Cosecha Colectiva, which translates to collective harvest, where we have a decentralized garden where community members grow their own food. People already have property to grow food, so instead we use that property, and then we kind of map out who's growing what, and once that produce is ready to harvest, members will bring it to community member meetings, and then they exchange in that way, right? But what happened with Excite was that people didn't want to grow their food anymore. They're like, if that is in my soil, I'm not trying to eat what comes out of that soil. And so we had to go on with a different approach, and we did raised beds. We did garden boxes for community members. But, you know, we still need our guayaba trees, you know, like we still need our limon trees. So we're still using those. And then you have programs at East Yards like the Marina Pando Research program, where we open it up to our youth members that are about to graduate high school or in college or just graduated college to do community research, community participatory research. So with Excite, we had some youth members that wanted to learn how to test water and test the LA River for soil. And we were able to use that, right, to take it to the agency to make our own case that there was lead in the river, right? And so when I think about like what the panel's all about, like reproductive health, reproductive justice, it's really thinking about how the EJ movement even began. It was because mothers were starting to ask questions about why their children were sick. And I think that was also similar for a lot of the people that pushed the work at East Yard, is a lot of women. And it's the reason why this room is overwhelmingly women, because we need to start having these conversations. So Excite is one thing. Excite happened, and now we're cleaning it up. DTSC is actually not doing their job right in cleaning it up, right? We're talking 10,000 residential homes, and up to this day, they've only cleaned up to 220 homes, right? Like, where is the urgency? One thing that we were successful in was to make sure that cleanup hired 50% of local hires. Why? Because if something wasn't gonna, if they weren't doing that cleanup right, but the workers lived in those communities, they would be the ones to speak up about it. And that actually has happened, right? And we hear from community members that they come and they clean the house, and then they tell them, oh yeah, we don't need to do that. Oh yeah, we'll come later. Oh yeah, we already scheduled you, we'll be there, and they don't show up. And so I think it's really offensive for women and children to be going to bed tonight knowing that they're sleeping in homes, that their soil is literally toxic waste.
We've written out a couple questions that the panel is going to tackle. The first one is what makes good partner for community participatory research, and I think I will give you my take on that. We've had a lot of sampling and testing in our community, and I think what really makes good partners on both ends, because I'm not sure, are they asking, is it the community? What kind of a good community makes a good partner? Or are the researchers that make a good partner? And I think people in general is the qualities that come in people and the compassion that you have for people that are going through this. This is, you know, when you have a natural disaster, there's a beginning and an end. And something that has been studied is the psychological effects of living in a toxic community, and it never ends. So you're constantly under this kind of stress. And if you don't have compassion and you can't think out of the box and bring in your good investigation skills, I don't think you're gonna have, you know, a very good collaboration on anything. Some communities, I think, particularly mine, feel like we've been tested enough. You know what the problem is, and now let's really get to the solutions. And I think that, you know, we heard about people going and doing their own water samples or their own soil samples. And a lot of times, the regulatory agencies and the enforcement agencies get all freaked out at you and are like, oh, well, we can't take that to court, as if like they're taking everything to court anyway. But we're really telling them, if you're not gonna do it, it's not rocket science. We can go collect a sample, and if it's not gonna fit your box for taking someone to court, go collect your own samples and follow up on what we found. So I think we're at the point in a lot of senses that we understand what the agencies are doing and what they're not doing, and it's really time for the people to take action. And part of these workshops are to help, you know, let you know that you have to be responsible. A lot of people, if they knew that they had to do this one particular thing, they would be on it. But there's this feeling that if you're paying your taxes and you're doing the things you're supposed to be doing, the other people doing their jobs are doing the things they're supposed to be doing. And what I really heard is like, yeah, that's not the case. And so the sooner that you know that, I think the quicker our communities will get cleaned up. So I'm gonna toss that one to the rest of the panelists. It's what makes a good partner for community participatory research. Question.
Just to follow up with what you're saying, you know, there's a really large kind of gap between where communities are in terms of what they know about their communities. They're experts in their communities, but there's a disconnect between how communities monitor and collect their data and what agencies will accept. And so for the longest time, I heard from the agencies like, well, we gotta pull communities. You know, they have to do their data quality assurances, and they have the chain of custody right. We got to pull them like more towards us. And so what we've been working on at my organization is, yes, we have to increase the capacity and the training for communities to provide better quality data, but you also have to move toward the community. There has to be a meeting in the middle where the agencies are flexible enough and value community knowledge enough so that they change their protocols and they change their practices, and maybe there's some triggers. So if the community's finding things in the community, even if they don't do it exactly according to the agency protocol, that it triggers something, you know, follow-up, monitoring. And so we're actually partnering now with BPSC and other agencies to create a training program where on the one hand we're training the communities to provide better quality data, but we're also working with the agencies to change their policies. And so right now we're looking at what can we do right now with the current authority to make it so that when community does generate data, even if it's not up to your standards, you can use it somehow. So again, I think it's both sides moving together, because until we get there, you know, we're gonna keep missing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely agree with everything Ingrid just said. I think that is one of the challenges because I think one of the most critical things as far as being a big partner is being able to listen to and learn from one another, especially the community, because they are the ones being impacted by these issues, by these challenges, and they're going to know what's best for them. So being able to listen to the community, but also finding that middle ground, that meeting place where we can actually use the data that is collected by the community. Because I know that is something that we are working through with our project work now, is figuring out, okay, we've taught, you know, the community this about what's happening, and they've taught us, you know, this information about what's happening. They provided us with this data. How can we use this data? How can the regulatory agencies use this data to inform that policy, to inform better practices, to change the way that they regulate these industries and these businesses? Because we actually have talked to some agencies, and I won't call any by name, but they've, you know, kind of said like, oh, it's just a gas station, or it's just this, or it's just a auto body shop. You know, who cares? Like, if they're not doing that much damage, and like, that's not the problem. That's not what the residents are saying. That's not, you know, what, you know, the families or the children are saying when they're sick, when they're going to the hospital because of asthma attacks. It's not what they're saying. So finding out ways to be able to use that data, really hearing the community, not just, you know, kind of going through the motions for the sake of saying like, oh, we did this with the residents, so everything's fine.
So thinking about community like participatory research and partners, and I think we need to start with thinking about how community views research in the first place, or like experts, right? And so because you're talking about community members that relied on government agencies to give them the data and to give them the truth, right? Where community members notice that there's flares going on in their backyard, and they call and they say, is that dangerous? And the agencies tell them, you're fine. It's not a problem. And so how we apply that in context, right? I remember when I was in school, and my teacher was telling me the story of Thanksgiving. And I think this is so on point because it's about to be Thanksgiving. So she was telling me how the Pilgrims came and how they sat for dinner, right, with Native people. And so I shared that with my mom. And my mom's like, well, that's not how that really happened, right? People didn't just come and eat dinner and everything is okay. And I was just like, well, doesn't my teacher know everything? Because that's what I thought. I thought teachers know everything. And my mom was like, no. Like, teachers do not know everything. And so I think that that same philosophy is what applies in the work that we do at ECRs. It's that we work internally to really build that leadership capacity within community members, and so that they learn the capacity of building their own narrative and working with communications. It's about working with members to really learn how to understand policy, and so that when we get partners, they know what are our standards. They know how they need to fit to be capable to move our work, right? Because our work is charged with a lot of moral authority. And so for example, I definitely want to highlight PSR because when I was brought onto ECR, the campaign that I'm working on is on pesticides. You would think, why would ECRs out of commerce, working with community members from Long Beach, Linwood, Southeast LA, and East LA, are doing on pesticides? And so I'm working on a campaign where we're looking at a manufacturing plant of pesticides in the city of Commerce. And one of our partners within that campaign is PSR. And I see how much PSR really prioritizes what does the community want. How is the community going to understand what this industry is doing and how to understand the permit issues, the regulation issues, right? And so I definitely value that. And it's understanding that if your partner values you as a central, like, mover and shaker for the work, then I think that's when it makes sense. And, you know, also, they were looking to hire a program coordinator to overlook the campaign that we were on. So what did they do? They invited us into the hiring process, right? They really, really value, like, that the person that they bring on is going to be able to pick up your work because they know it's community sensitive. And so I definitely wanted to highlight that as an example of what we mean by that.
Well, I think those are great examples, and I keep hearing transparency, you know, weaving through there. I think sometimes people come to our communities and they're gonna fix something for us, you know, and I think if they were gonna do that, they would have already done it a long time ago, and we would be about our business, whatever it was we were doing. And so it's really hearing from the communities what they think the solutions are and, you know, taking that lead from them. So those are some really good examples. The second question that we have here is, what lessons learned would have been helpful to know prior to addressing cleanup efforts? I'll take a little stab at what we learned. So DDT, we have many chemicals in our community, but DDT is one of our top nasties. And so DDT, the reason that DDT is such a nasty chemical is it was genetically manufactured to stay on the crops. You know, farmers were putting pesticides on the crops, and then when they would water them, their product that they just paid money for would get washed off, and they didn't really like that. So DDT is a hydrophobic chemical that hates water. It loves fat. So if you're exposed to it, like, you know, be storing over here on this side and over here on this side, and you know, can pass on to your children through breastfeeding and things of that nature. And we fought in the beginning so hard for people to give us the medicine for DDT exposure. And I really thought that there was a cure. And I'm talking to pretty high level people in the agencies, federal and state. And it took maybe 5 or 6 years before somebody finally said, there is no cure for DDT. There is no charcoal pill you can take that'll pull it out of your body. And so what I've learned and what I really put at the forefront of a lot of the work that we do is the old adage, prevention is the cure. And that's something that we need to keep thinking about. You know, we heard Ingrid talked about, you know, the sites that we have and the contamination and what's being looked at and what's not, and our landfills are getting filled up, and they're in our sisters and brothers communities, and things have gone awry, and it's really time for the community people to be empowered. It's been, you know, when I started, there weren't many folks of color in my community that could even grasp what was going on, because people truly believe that if they're paying their rent and they're doing their part, other people are doing theirs. And they really don't have this concept. But once you put this knowledge into the hands of the people, they can come up with some pretty amazing solutions that are pretty right on. So I would say honesty is something that would have been really helpful. If people would have told me that they didn't know, I wouldn't have been trying so hard to pry it out of them. And once we found out we didn't know, we could start moving on to other things. So I think that would have been really helpful for us. That and some shovels, and we could have got started on our cleanup a lot earlier.
The thing that keeps me up at night is this seemingly unsolvable problem with the shifting burdens that I talked about. So I represented Calumet City for many years. Then I also worked with a lot of the facility, but I also worked with a lot of contaminated sites where they wanted it gone. They said, take this soil and take it out of my community. And I knew it was going to Calumet. So I was placed in this really uncomfortable position. It was like, well, I want Calumet City to not have to bear this huge burden for the whole state, and yet these communities living on top of these contaminated sites are in extreme danger. And I also don't want it to go to Nevada and Arizona for the reasons I said. So it was almost intractable. And so really, in order to kind of comprehensively solve this problem, or at least reduce the burdens, is prevention, and it's upstream reduction. If we generate less hazardous waste, if we responsibly and we have oversight and enforcement so that we're not contaminated places, at all, that's where we have to go. And California as a state discontinued its pollution prevention program in 2012. And that was a program that looked at industrial processes. We kept track for many years about the best and cleanest ways that we could, spur our economy through industrial use, industrial activities in the cleanest way possible. So we tracked all of the different ways that we could reduce pollution and hazardous waste at the tailpipe. And we have discontinued it. There is no more tracking. And there's certainly no requirements that we actually implement all of the pollution reduction techniques that we did find out. So I think that's where we start. We re-implement the pollution prevention program, and we don't make it voluntary, we make it mandatory. It's always involved. Make it mandatory. And then we need to be innovative. So instead of either digging and hauling and putting it in Kettleman City, or putting a cap on it, neither of which is good, is we need to be technology forcing. We need to figure out how to actually destroy the contaminations, so that it's not just being shifted from one community to the other. So if California is going to invest in some long-term thinking, and they have a 50% hazardous waste goal if they want to meet by 2030, those are the real issues that we're going to have to grapple with, and we're not anywhere close to have these conversations.
Yeah, I would have to piggyback on that, because I think for us it's largely looking at, number one, the obstacles. So even just within government regulatory agencies, what are they saying is feasible or not feasible? And it's just the idea that that cleaning up the community is not an option, which is really frustrating, because it's like there's always some excuses of why they can't do it, because this is too expensive, this is too costly, this isn't doable, and we know that's not true. So really looking for alternatives to a lot of these things. So like Cynthia said, looking at prevention, and using cleaner chemicals in different ways to eliminate what's already been contaminated. PSRLA is doing a lot of work in that in terms of just transition, especially in the metals industry, to make sure that, because there are actually cleaner ways for the metals industry to operate. There are cleaner ways for dry cleaners to operate. And if there was some sort of resources available so that, number one, these industries knew this, and number two, that if there is some sort of transition cost that this is provided, that we could easily make the community cleaner without these industries and these businesses incurring, irreparable harm. Because a lot of these people in the community operating these businesses, they live there as well, and they're not there to hurt people, but a lot of times they just don't have the resources or the knowledge, and we should be providing that. California should see to it that we have that kind of technology and resources available. There are plants that you can plant, trees that will clean the soil. These things exist. It's a matter of using them. So there's lots of work being done, within a lot of our organizations to work to find cleaner alternatives and doing alternatives assessments, instead of saying, what can we do after we've used this chemical to make sure it's cleaner, saying, can we use a different chemical? But there does need to be a push by these regulatory agencies and by the state to actually enforce policies and require that these alternative products, these alternative chemicals be used that are cleaner, that are safer, that aren't going to create pollution that we have to clean up later. Because there's no point in even using a lot of these anymore, because sometimes they are more expensive. But we've seen that they're definitely more dangerous, and that should be the priority.
So if there's anything that we learned when it comes to cleanup efforts, is do not let the agencies do it. They were the ones that kind of caused it. So how would we trust them to clean it up? And they always say that they don't have enough resources, but we need to think about how they prioritize those resources, right? And who gets prioritized, and who benefits from those, and who gets neglected because of that. And so, when we think about how long it took us to shut down Exide, it was 30 years, like a good 3 decades. It took, and how it started was people were just noticing things each other. So it took 30 years for that to happen, and it takes a lot of time for a lot of our work to happen. But then, you know, I think about the Aliso Canyon gas leak and the urgency from the state. And what happened at Aliso Canyon was devastating. And the way that the agencies handled that was so wrong, right? After it happened, you had a lot of the community be relocated. And they were able to move their pets as well to shelters so they can, you know, have their pets safe. But, you know, you have people in our community that if they were, you know, if they were given a hotel, that was way far away from where they lived. And if they didn't, they're still living under the scope of like, that's not urgent. So, you know, these cleanup efforts, I just want to, you know, offer that kind of like how it was already touched upon, is that we need to look at cleanup efforts as a potential global harm, right? Is that if we stop one industry, we can stop that industry from perpetuating other homes or perpetuating other uses of exposures to toxics, right? Because what corporations do is they rationalize the use of poison. They rationalize this use. And so, you know, thinking about the industry that I had mentioned, the one in Commerce, AMBAC, who is a pesticide manufacturing facility, they are one of the leading producers in organophosphates. That word is irrelevant unless you know that they use organophosphates in chemical warfare, and it's a neurotoxic, right? So you're talking about this is in our backyards, and then we need to think about how is that product being moved? Where does that product go? And we see that where these industries create their products, where those products are applied, is also in communities and where people that look like us. And so AMVAC was moving a train with metamsodium. Metasodium is something so toxic, and I think you probably know about this. But in the early 90s, that train overturned. It overturned, and when it overturned, it causes huge toxic clouds. And it was like in the Central Valley where it overturned. When it overturned, it dumped waste into the Sacramento River. But just know that it wiped out 42 miles of wildlife within that river. And so this is what we're dealing with in our backyards, right? It's huge multi-billion-dollar entities. And then you have places like the ports in Long Beach, and why ECRS's work in Long Beach is because what's in those ports feeds the goods movement. And you know, what is coming from those ports comes to the rail yards. And those rail yards are in our homes too, and they're close proximity to homes and parks. East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice, the East Yard is that rail yard, right? That goes from Commerce to downtown LA. And how the pesticide work is applied there is that in Southern California, the largest concentration of pesticide use is in the ports. Why do we think that is? Because every container is sprayed with pesticides. So if I could just do a little pitch here, before you put on your clothes, you need to wash it. And so you're having high concentration use where people are vulnerable. You're having high concentration of these chemicals in the Central Valley where people live in agriculture and are dealing with things like Kettleman City did, right? So we need to start thinking about cleanup efforts as this huge systemic global issue. And that what is impacting our backyard, our front yard, our adjacent yards, right? right? We cannot limit our scope to only think about the fight is here. But to see our work as like really interconnected, right? Which makes sense because a lot of the work that PSR does, it makes sense to work together, right? And so I just want to leave that piece of like some things that we would change with cleanup efforts is to begin to look at that and to push agencies, like, no, don't push them, like literally like get on these agencies to begin to look at cleanup efforts in that way as well.
Thank you, Jen. We're gonna open it up to some questions. Anybody have any questions for the panel? Yes.
I have a question for Janet. The organization that you mentioned, or Exide, is that so?
Yeah, Exide Technologies,
Exide, how do you spell that?
EXIDE. They are a car battery recycling facility. So recycling isn't always the best thing.
I just wanted to get that means, like, look into it.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you for the wonderful information that you have provided. It's so overwhelming, but at least we can start from one end to see how we can make inroads into this problem. My question is this: is there a registry where, like young people are coming out of schools and they're trying to buy homes? Usually when people are buying homes, they look at the structure, how big it is, how beautiful it is, how the interior of the homes suits your lifestyle or my lifestyle. Nobody thinks about what is under those homes. Is there a registry where I have children who are ready to buy homes, and all they are looking at is how big and how gorgeous they look at it in their home? Is there a registry where before they even look at any structures of the neighborhood, where they can go and see what's under the soil where that house is built? My second question is, most of us work in very old buildings, and people have mysterious illnesses. What do they call? When we say a nurse in the building, and we go and we do all the vital signs and we don't find anything. Once 911 comes, is there a place where we can go and find out what is under the soil of that building where we are working, when we go every day to spend half of our lives? Thank you.
There's no such registry. There are, so no. So there isn't a comprehensive place you can go. If you're trying to get some sense as if there's like an identified cleanup site, you can go to, it's called Enviro Store, and you can pop in like an address and then we'll zoom in and you can see where the cleanup areas are around. But it won't go down to like the building or the structure. You can also, I don't know how many people are familiar with Enviro Screen, so that's not about soil in particular, but if you want to look at like a cumulative burden on a particular neighborhood or a particular census tract, you can type in an address and it'll show you like the relative ranking of your neighborhood in terms of the pollution burden and the vulnerability of the community there. So it's basically from 0 to 100. So the most polluted places, cumulatively polluted places, and most vulnerable will be in like the 90 to 100 percentile. It'll be red, all the way down to like green. So the very clean places are green. So you can get a sense of your at the neighborhood level how bad the total pollution burden is, and then you can look at cleanup sites on a website called Enviro Store.
What was the other one? What was that second
Enviro Screen. Enviro Screen.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, that Enviro Screen also does a really good job in like showing where the environmental racism is, because oftentimes you'll see that where the red is, you're able to see who are the most vulnerable there, and so you're able to connect those dots. So I definitely wanted to add that.
I want to talk a little bit about that too. So part of what my organization is finally doing is we're going to do our own land use plan for our community, because we're going to be dead by the time other people get to it. And so we have spent a lot of time recently looking at old aerial photographs of the area. So no, there's no registry, no, there's no one-stop shop, unfortunately. but you can get a lot of information just by doing some research on your areas. The ground truthing is one way. And in doing this research for our group recently, we just had a conference here on Monday. I had probably 30 aerial photographs from 1941 till present. And I'm looking at them, and I know my community pretty well, so I'm seeing stuff, and I'm seeing stuff. And we have a natural estuary area where our community used to be. And so I'm watching, and they're showing how just everything flowed open. You know, we had where we are, you could go from Santa Monica all the way to the San Pedro Harbor through these estuaries. So I'm watching, and all of a sudden, the estuary part is gone. There's a new concrete culvert, and everything has been developed. And it dawns on me, nothing has been sampled. Nothing has been sampled. So any of the industrial areas that were anywhere around these natural drainage areas where things flowed into it, nobody sampled. So we have kind of a two-pronged problem. We have this legacy problem where we don't know, and we don't have people actively going out there to try and find it, which really leaves the burden on the community. When you get sick, that's when you start usually getting involved. And then we have a moving forward problem, which we heard about when, you know, tankers and trucks and these chemicals are coming through your community, you know, and having accidents, or just the fact that people aren't using chemicals that are probably more expensive but less harmful to people and to the environment. And another thing that we have recently seen in our community when they did do a cleanup was they take these folks are just not paying any money to do these cleanups, so they take it very cavalier, I guess. And so these guys dug up all this clean soil and put it in a big pile, and then they dug up all the toxic soil and set it right on top. Well, like, we don't have landfill space. Why isn't there a much better importance on figuring out which are the pieces? You know, I think about Exide a lot, and I think they're gonna make a mountain of toxic soil somewhere, and then they're gonna have to take a mountain down to go fill the yards again. So as I'm debriefing from my thing, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, we might get to a point which people should think about where when you go buy a home, they're already gonna have a vapor barrier under there. And you might have to bring your own soil with you. That might be something that you pack up when you move. And the only reason that I'm saying that is not to be like, oh, let's give up. Because if you have good information in front of you, you're gonna make good decisions. And the problem is nobody's telling you there's a problem. So I say to the agency people, we know there's a problem, start fessing up, and let's figure out better, you know, ways to tackle that problem. But I wish there was, you know, but it's just all of us is gonna be the solution. You know, and when you have an area like Los Angeles that is so saturated, I understand sometimes why the planners are ripping their hair out. I see it's not just because they don't like me, because they've made themselves a big hole. And if they would just listen to a lot of us, we could probably help them get out of it. Did you have some final thoughts, Jazmine?
No, I don't know if you want to take
Oh,
more
I'm
time.
sorry, Lauren.
I'm gonna say very little, because as far as I'm concerned, this has been a tremendous panel. And a lot of really solid, truthful information has been shared. But one thing that really, and I wanna say two things. One is, getting to the point where people defend themselves through various methods, be it indoor air filtering, be it drinking water filters on their faucets, whatever it might be, some combination of things that people are doing to protect their health and welfare on their own has just gotta someday, some part of this picture has gotta be that. But the other thing that I wanna say, which might be a perspective that other people haven't brought up, is chemicals are not all the same. And somehow as time goes by, it all gets kind of glopped together as chemicals that are dangerous. But the dangers of chemicals are very chemical specific and very different. And the other missing piece is that nobody, and I can tell you this for sure, ever looks at what happens when you're not just exposed to one chemical, you're exposed to 20, like we are in our the people in our community. And they don't even wanna tell you they don't have the answer to that, which goes back to some of the things that Cynthia was saying. So, another thing I'll say too is, all of this is also related to better technologies to do things differently. All of this is related to that. And when DTSC got rid of their pollution prevention program, that was a setback, a very backward step, because the best answers are going to be the answers we come up with in the future, and they absolutely are going to depend on finding new ways of doing things, advanced, technical, planting trees because they can help prevent air pollution and also clean up the soil. Getting better at doing all those things, but also looking toward the future with one piece of it being finding new ways of doing things. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence. I want to remind you that your valuations are really important. When we have our conferences, that's what I read when I get home after the hard road and trying to, make things better and make sure that we did a good job. So please don't forget to do that. And I just do want to say something about Florence. She's the chair of our board. And Florence worked at DTSC and with EPA for 30 years. And I watched my girl Florence a lot because her heart is so big and she's such an awesome person. And I know when she was in enforcement in DTSC, she did not run her enforcement team the way that she sees things are happening. And so not only is it very hard on us, but there are people in these agencies that are very thoughtful and they care. And I see her heart get broken a lot when she hears from communities and thinks, wow, I was so proud of what I did, and you sure should be because you had a great team. But it's just, again, I think remembering that compassion that we have. It's hard to have compassion when you're being attacked and your family's sick and dying. But a lot of the other people are impacted too, and they just haven't even put it together yet. Because air pollution doesn't discriminate. So thank you all very much. And thank you to our experts.